I'm Curran Bhatia in Times Square with the man, BC, Brian Campbell. You're hosting the press conference today. Diaz, Masvidal 2. I don't know. Are we calling it a rematch because the first fight was in mixed martial arts rules in UFC? Now we're doing boxing.
I'm hoping the trilogy's a street fight behind the dumpsters in the back. But yeah, night 2 of the 4-city baddest tour here in Times Square. Miami and LA to come, and you get personalities with the icon, fan recognition that these two have. You know it's going to be exciting because those guys bring violence in the cage or now in a boxing ring where they go. And this is an interesting fight and an interesting tour so far.
What did you notice? You're hosting these press conferences. It's a world tour, seemingly. We're going all around. What did you notice in the first press conference with the demeanor of each guy in terms of confidence and things like that? The one thing I'll say, just to even set you up, Masvidal won the first fight seemingly handily. Maybe Diaz was coming back. The doctor stopped it. We know what happened there. But it seems like, at least from Masvidal's words, Diaz has been the one saying, hey, my name first, And so it's an interesting mental games going on. What did you notice?
It is, and some of it is gamesmanship, but I think some of it is absolute fact. Jorge Masvidal was granted a release from his UFC deal to be able to box up to 3 times while retaining his contract for when he does eventually come back in MMA. And I think for Nate Diaz, he didn't hide his words Friday at the first stop. He said, I wanted this to be an MMA rematch, but it had to be a boxing rematch. And I think he just leveraged an exercise, which we've seen in boxing so many times. Who's the A side? We've got 2 stars, but somebody's got to be the A side. A side does have his privileges, and it seems, according to Jorge, that Nate has exercised a lot of those. So that's certainly fueling the tension between the two without question. But what did I learn from their demeanors? That Jorge is, as always, is charismatic, outgoing, but there is an edge. There is a legitimate edge. There was respect between these two when they fought for the BMF title in the UFC in 2019. And according to Jorge, that changed due to some comments through the years. Nate's always hard to read, but we'll see tonight if he can come out of his shell a little bit more as we continue to hype this thing up.
Nate actually has a ton of personality, but sometimes he keeps it under
it's
wraps.
Personality, for sure.
Exactly.
I mean, he's as unique as a personality that basically became an anti-hero, and he has more street cred along with Masvidal than anybody else. That speaks for itself in a lot of ways.
And I actually noticed that building up to their first fight in UFC was that there actually was a lot of mutual respect.
Sure.
I think they see the toughness that each man has, and that probably was amplified in their fight together. Like we said, Masvidal having success, it seemed like he was landing combinations at will. And then Diaz, you can never count him out. Just as Conor McGregor.
Late
so many different people. Exactly.
Has to absorb damage seemingly to get really going, but then he's got that unstoppable cardio, that will to fight. Yes. Unfortunately, the New York Commission ended up making the decision they did to protect the scar tissue in his eyes right there. But, can Jorge have bragging rights in the first one? Absolutely. But that was also peak Jorge. Meaning 2019 Jorge Masvidal was a mythical creature. He was the fighter of the year, scored the fastest knockout in UFC history. Is he that same guy? That's certainly something that he's going to have to prove in this boxing ring. He has a pro fight back in 2005, but it was 4 rounds. Do you really count that? No.
That was a little while ago.
Nate's coming directly off 10 rounds with Jake Paul. That's going to be interesting when you really ask yourself, who actually does have the edge in this one?
Right. Well, that was my question, stylistically, right? We know what they can do in MMA. We've seen them, long resumes. They've fought a who's who of names. But how does it translate to boxing? And so one thing about Jorge is he does have a stand-up style. He can bang and trade. Diaz just came off of a boxing performance. He's active. It wasn't necessarily, let's say, the best performance. It wasn't a win.
Right.
But he's entertaining. He was entertaining. Definitely entertaining. Definitely entertaining. And you can never count him out just based on, like you said, his cardio, his will, all of that stuff. How do you think their skills will translate to the boxing?
That's the question that you can't answer until you see it, because that in this crossover bubble era of boxing where YouTubers, where ex-NBA and football stars, where everyone's sort of getting their chance in boxing, not everybody can transition specifically from MMA to boxing overnight. Sure. Conor McGregor, for as big as that fight was with Floyd Mayweather, and even though Conor, I think, in some ways over-exceeded expectations technique-wise, but really wasn't able to bring the power that he brings to the UFC cage with the different footwork to boxing. Somebody like Anderson Silva, though, went from late 40s retiring from the UFC to beating Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., okay, maybe damaged goods, but his ability to transition was overnight. So we only have one piece of evidence from Nate against Jake Paul, and he looked like we said, okay. We're not really going to know, even though Masvidal has great hands, even though he's been a backyard boxing brawler since the Kimbo Slice days. Right. We're not really going to know how comfortable he's going to be in until June 1st. And how about this? It's not a 4, 6, 8 round fight. It's a 10-round fight. That's going to be a different stamina breakdown. It's going to be so different in every way. I don't really know who has the edge. Who has the power edge? Probably Masvidal. But Nate's also been sparring against Andre Ward, against, former title contenders in real boxing gyms for the last 15 years.
It's going to be fascinating to see what happens. I'm going to ask you your official pick of the main event. But first, I just want to talk about this undercard because it's a really interesting undercard.
Yes.
We're here on Haney Garcia Fight Week, and Ryan Garcia's brother is on the on the undercard. We also have one of the Vargas kids, so it's a really interesting stacked undercard as well. Right?
Yeah, Amado Vargas, the second of the three fighting sons of the great world champion Fernando Vargas. Both are unbeaten. Him and Sean Garcia, both are 23 years old. It's an interesting matchup because they've circled each other in amateur boxing for years, know each other very well. I didn't expect at Friday night's first press conference in Las Vegas for the temperature to go from 0 to 60, because here's a little bit of inside info. Behind the scenes, on the stage, these two did have mutual respect for each other, gave each other the hug and said, look, man, good to see you. Haven't seen you around in a while. But once it got time to talk fight, it was, well, I'm going to knock you out cold. And then suddenly Ryan Garcia's on the stage. It got a little bit wild, and I think that adds interest. And that's what you need on these type of undercards. It's always going to be a mix of real boxing, of crossover boxing on these type of events. But these are recognized names. And then you look at that co-main event, you get a former UFC champion, Anthony Pettis, who just beat Roy Jones. Oh, aftermarket Roy Jones in many ways, there's no doubt. But him going in there against Chris Avila, part of the Nate Diaz camp, who's won 5 straight in boxing circles, beating guys from BKFC, from the entertainment world, from MMA. It's a little bit interesting. You never know in those fights who's going to end up having the better stamina, and then who's going to be able to transition, like we said, that technique from MMA to boxing. It's going to be fun.
I'm going to ask you 2 quick questions here because I know you got to run and host this thing. Number one, we saw the first leg, and we saw Nate Diaz, we saw Masvidal. What do you expect tonight for this press conference? Anything different, demeanor-wise? How do you think this is going to? I
think it's going to be edgier than the first one, and I think that because Jorge used that platform, like we talked about, to air out a little bit of the dirty laundry behind the scenes. The interviews he's done since then has really doubled down on him calling Nate Diaz a diva, him calling Nate Diaz all these things. Well, now Nate's going to have to answer that on here. So I think it's going to be jacked up a little more. I think they both realize they're entertainers. How do you build interest in this fight game? You get real, right? I mean, Nate Diaz's promotion is called Real Fight Inc. Right. It's like you get real, you get personal. I expect that tonight, and I also expect a lot of machismo when you have these tours. Is this Hagler Hearns? No, but Hagler Hearns did a 20-date press tour, something like that, across the country. These guys got tired of seeing each other. Yeah. We don't see a lot of big tours like this. Yep. This is stop 2. Miami tomorrow, Jorge's backyard. Like, it's gonna, I think, get tuned up each stop on the journey, and it's gonna be fun to be a part of.
Shades of the McGregor Mayweather. Speaking of crossover events, right? The World Tour. My last question, and this is why I called it the unofficial official pick, because I know you're working this event. So only if you feel comfortable giving an official pick. But if you don't, then let's get your unofficial way of how the fight's gonna play out. What your thoughts on, how the fight's gonna play out?
I don't really know. And one thing Jorge has said, and I think it's true. Or I don't know how much of it is true, but he is accusing Nate of not taking Jake Paul seriously. He didn't think he got into the real fighting shape that he needed to be. That maybe he was a little just happy to be there. Like, I can handle this guy. Turned out to be a harder fight for him than he thought. That leads me to believe Nate's going to turn it up more because he knows the animal across from him. He knows that Masvidal's coming for his chin and is going to go after it. I think we'll see a fun war. I don't think it goes the distance. That's the only prediction I can give you at this point, is I think we'll actually, look, not all of these crossover fights hit. I think in the ring, this one's going to hit.
All right, well, I think it's going to hit first at this press conference where they're going to talk smack. You're going to be hosting, BC. Thank you so much for your time, brother.
Always, brother. Good seeing you.